The gunshot that shattered the peaceful morning came from somewhere behind the stable, and Victoria Sommers dropped the water bucket she had been carrying, her heart lurching into her throat as she recognized the voice that followed her father's business partner, Clement Rhodes, shouting orders to the men who had been circling their property for days. She had known this moment would come ever since she refused his proposal 3 weeks ago, ever since she told him in no uncertain terms that she would rather die than marry a man who had cheated dozens of homesteaders out of their land claims. Her father lay cold in his grave barely 2 months, victim of what the town doctor had called pneumonia, but what Victoria suspected was something far more sinister. And now, Rhodes wanted to claim everything her father had built, including her. She ran toward the house, her boots slipping on the icy ground as the November wind bit through her wool coat. Shoshone City, Idaho had been hit with an early winter, and the temperatures had plummeted over the past week, turning the usually manageable cold into something brutal and unforgiving. Snow clouds gathered overhead, dark and ominous, promising the kind of storm that could bury a person alive if they were caught unprepared. Victoria burst through the door and grabbed the rifle her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12 years old, checking to make sure it was loaded before moving to the window. Through the frost-rimmed glass, she counted them. 10 men, all armed, all loyal to Rhodes or at least loyal to his money. They were spreading out around the property, cutting off escape routes, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Rhodes himself sat astride a gray horse near the front gate, his expensive coat and hat marking him as different from the rough cowboys who did his dirty work. He was shouting something she could not quite hear, probably another demand that she come out and sign over the deed to her father's freight business and the valuable land it sat on. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rifle. She was a good shot, but she was one woman against 10 men, and even if she managed to hold them off until nightfall, what then? The storm was coming, and she had nowhere to run. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the town marshal was in Rhodes's pocket, paid to look the other way whenever Rhodes decided to expand his empire through intimidation and violence. A sound at the back door made her whirl around, her finger on the trigger, but she stopped herself just in time. Standing in the doorway was not one of Rhodes's men but someone else entirely, a tall cowboy with snow dusting his dark hair and shoulders, his blue eyes sharp and assessing as they took in her defensive stance, and the fear she was trying desperately to hide. "Madam, I do not mean you any harm," he said, his voice low and steady, his hands held away from the gun belt at his waist. "My name is Thomas Wade. I was riding through when I saw those men surrounding your place. Figured you might need some help." Victoria kept the rifle pointed at him, her mind racing. She had seen him around town a few times over the past month, a drifter who had taken work at the Miller Ranch breaking horses. He had a reputation for being quiet, keeping to himself, staying out of trouble. But she had also heard whispers that he had been a hired gun down in Texas, that he had killed men before, though whether those killings had been justified or not depended on who was telling the story. "Why would you help me?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "You do not know me. This is not your fight." Thomas stepped fully into the house, closing the door behind him against the wind that was picking up outside. He was probably 25 or 26, she guessed, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under the sun, and the hardness in his eyes that came from seeing too much violence. But there was something else there too, something that made her hesitate, a kind of decency that Rhodes and his men had never possessed. "I know Rhodes," Thomas said simply. "I know what kind of man he is." I know he has been stealing land from people who cannot fight back, and I know that if I ride away and leave you here alone, you will be dead or worse by nightfall. That is reason enough." Outside, Rhodes's voice rose again, and this time Victoria could make out the words. "Victoria Sommers, you have 5 minutes to come out here and sign these papers, or I am sending my men in to fetch you. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." Thomas moved to the window, staying to the side so he would not present an easy target, and looked out at the men surrounding the property. His expression did not change, but Victoria saw his jaw tighten slightly. 10 of them," he muttered. "Rhodes always did like to stack the odds in his favor." "You should leave," Victoria said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she did not want him to go. "This is not worth dying for." Thomas turned to look at her, and for a moment their eyes met and held. "Everyone has to decide what is worth dying for, madam. I decided a long time ago that I was tired of watching men like Rhodes take whatever they want just because they have the guns and the money to do it. If I am going to make a stand, might as well be for something that matters." The first snowflakes began to fall as the 5 minutes ticked down, fat and heavy, the kind that would quickly pile up and turn the world into a white wasteland. Victoria felt a strange calm settle over her as she realized that this was really happening, that Thomas Wade, a man she barely knew, was willing to stand between her and 10 armed men because it was the right thing to do. She had spent the past 3 weeks feeling utterly alone, trapped by circumstances she could not control. But now, with this quiet cowboy standing in her father's house, she felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "They are coming," Thomas said, his voice still calm, still steady. He drew his revolver, checked the chamber, and moved toward the door. "Stay inside. No matter what happens, you stay inside and keep that rifle ready. If any of them get past me, you shoot them. You understand?" Victoria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She watched as Thomas opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, his gun hanging loose at his side, his posture relaxed in a way that she knew was deceptive. She had seen gunfighters before, men who made their living with violence, and they all had that same quality, that ability to appear calm right up until the moment they moved with lethal speed. Rhodes saw Thomas and reined in his horse, his expression shifting from confidence to irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he called out. "Nobody important," Thomas replied, his voice carrying easily across the yard despite the wind. "Just somebody who thinks you should turn around and ride back to town before this gets ugly." Rhodes laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "1 man against 10. Those are bad odds, friend. I suggest you walk away while you still can." "I have faced worse odds," Thomas said, and there was something in the way he said it that made several of Rhodes's men shift nervously in their saddles. "But I am not interested in killing anyone today if I can avoid it. You leave Miss Sommers alone and we all go home alive. Seems like a fair deal to me." "The woman owes me," Rhodes said, his voice hardening. "Her father took out loans to keep his business running, and I hold the notes. She cannot pay, which means everything here belongs to me now, including her if I decide to take her." "Her father never borrowed money from you," Victoria shouted from inside the house, unable to keep silent any longer. "Those papers you have are forgeries, and you know it. You want this land because the railroad is coming through next year, and you think you can sell it for 10 times what it is worth." Rhodes's face flushed with anger. "Enough talking. Boys, go get her." The men started to move forward, and Thomas raised his gun, not pointing it at anyone in particular but making it clear that he was ready to use it. "First man who takes another step gets a bullet," he said, his voice dropping into something cold and dangerous. You can test me if you want, but I promise you, some of you will not be going home tonight." The men hesitated, looking at Rhodes for guidance. They were hired guns, not heroes, and none of them wanted to be the first to find out if Thomas Wade was as fast as his reputation suggested. The snow was falling harder now, the wind whipping it into swirling patterns that made it difficult to see clearly. The storm was arriving faster than anyone had expected, and Victoria knew that in another hour, visibility would be near zero. "There are 10 of us," one of Rhodes's men said, though he sounded less certain than his words suggested. "Even if you are fast, you cannot get all of us." "Maybe not," Thomas agreed, "but I will get 3 or 4 before you bring me down, and I guarantee Rhodes will be one of them." So you boys need to ask yourselves, are you getting paid enough to die for this man's greed? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victoria could see the doubt spreading among Rhodes's men, could see them exchanging glances, weighing their options. They were being offered a way out, a chance to walk away without bloodshed, and some of them were clearly tempted. But Rhodes was not a man who tolerated defiance, and he knew he was losing control of the situation. $100 to the man who brings me that woman," Rhodes shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. $200 if you bring me Wade's body." Money changed the equation. Victoria saw the shift in the men's postures, saw greed overcome caution. They started to spread out, moving to flank the house from multiple directions, and Thomas did the only thing he could do. He shot the man closest to the porch, the bullet taking him in the shoulder and spinning him off his horse with a cry of pain. The sound of the gunshot cracked across the yard like thunder, and suddenly, everyone was moving. Thomas dove off the porch as bullets tore into the wood where he had been standing, rolling through the snow and coming up firing. Victoria saw another of Rhodes's men go down, this one clutching his leg, his horse bolting in panic. She raised her own rifle and fired through the window, aiming for the man trying to circle around to the back door. Her shot went wide, but it forced him to take cover behind the water trough, buying Thomas precious seconds. The world dissolved into chaos and gunfire and the howling wind of the approaching blizzard. Victoria lost track of how many shots were fired, lost track of everything except the desperate need to stay alive and to keep Thomas alive. She reloaded her rifle with shaking hands and fired again, and this time she saw her bullet strike one of Rhodes's men in the arm, sending his gun spinning away into the snow. Thomas was moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough for the men to get a clear shot at him. He used the well, the fence, the corner of the stable as cover, his gun barking steadily, each shot precise and deliberate. Another of Rhodes's men went down, then another, and suddenly the odds were shifting. The men who were still standing were backing away, their enthusiasm for the fight evaporating as they realized that Thomas Wade was every bit as dangerous as the stories claimed. "Fall back," one of them shouted. "This is not worth it." But Rhodes was beyond reason now, his face twisted with fury and humiliation. He spurred his horse forward, raising his own gun and firing wildly at the house. One of his bullets shattered the window next to Victoria, showering her with glass, and she stumbled backward with a cry. Thomas heard her and turned, and in that moment of distraction, Rhodes got off a shot that caught Thomas in the side, staggering him. Victoria screamed, watching Thomas go down to one knee, his free hand pressed against his ribs where blood was already staining his shirt. Rhodes laughed, that same harsh sound from before, and raised his gun for a killing shot. But Thomas was not done. Even wounded, even on his knees, he lifted his revolver with steady hands and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The first bullet hit Rhodes in the chest, the second in the shoulder, and the third went wild as Rhodes toppled from his horse and lay still in the snow. The sudden silence was deafening. The remaining men, seeing their employer dead and half their number wounded or down, made the smart choice. They grabbed the reins of the riderless horses and rode away as fast as they could, disappearing into the storm that was now a full-fledged blizzard. The snow so thick that they vanished from sight within seconds. Victoria ran from the house, her boots sliding on the icy porch steps, and reached Thomas just as he was trying to stand. "Do not move," she said, her hands on his shoulders, feeling the tremor that ran through him. "Let me see how bad it is." "I have had worse," Thomas said, but his voice was tight with pain, and when she pulled his coat aside to look at the wound, she saw that the bullet had torn a deep groove along his ribs. It was bleeding heavily, but did not look like it had hit anything vital. If she could stop the bleeding and keep infection from setting in, he would survive. "Come inside," she said, ducking under his arm to support his weight. "We need to get you warm and get this wound cleaned before the storm gets any worse." They stumbled together into the house, and Victoria kicked the door shut behind them, blocking out the wind and snow that was already piling up against the walls. She helped Thomas to the chair by the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until it was roaring, filling the room with heat and light. Then she fetched water and clean cloth, and the bottle of whiskey her father had kept for medicinal purposes, and set to work cleaning the wound. Thomas hissed in pain when the whiskey hit the raw flesh, but he did not cry out, did not pull away. He sat perfectly still while she worked, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and controlled. Victoria found herself studying his face in the firelight, noticing details she had not had time to see before: the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw clenched when a wave of pain hit him, the strength in the lines of his face that spoke of a life lived without compromise. "Why did you really do this?" she asked quietly as she wrapped clean bandages around his ribs. "You could have been killed. You almost were killed. For a woman you do not even know." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at her, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I told you the truth before. I am tired of watching men like Rhodes take whatever they want, but if I am being completely honest, there is more to it than that." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I saw you in town a few weeks back. You were coming out of the general store, carrying supplies, and some drunk cowboy bumped into you and knocked everything out of your arms. He did not apologize, just laughed and kept walking. But you did not cry or get angry. You just picked everything up and kept going, your head held high. And I thought to myself, there is a woman with real strength, the kind of strength that matters." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about you," Thomas said simply. "The way you walk, the way you talk, the way you did not back down from Rhodes even though you must have been terrified. I have been drifting for 5 years, madam, ever since I left Texas after my parents died. I have not had a reason to stay anywhere, have not had anything worth fighting for. But when I saw those men surrounding your house today, I knew I had found something worth standing up for. I found you." The words hung between them, honest and unadorned, and Victoria felt something break open inside her chest, some wall she had built to protect herself from more loss and pain. She finished tying off the bandage, and then did something she had not planned, something that surprised her as much as it clearly surprised Thomas. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and gentle, her hand coming up to cup his face. Thomas went still for a heartbeat, and then his arms came around her, careful of his injured ribs, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, turning from something tentative into something that spoke of need and longing, and the recognition of two souls that had been searching for each other without knowing it. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard, and Victoria could see her own wonder reflected in Thomas's eyes. "I do not even know you," she whispered, though she did not move away from the circle of his arms. "Then let me tell you about myself," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let me stay here while the storm passes, and I will tell you everything you want to know, and you can decide if I am the kind of man worth keeping around." Outside, the blizzard raged, piling snow against the house and turning the world into a frozen wasteland. But inside, in the warmth of the fireplace, Victoria and Thomas began to talk. He told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about learning to ride and shoot before he could read, about watching his father build something from nothing through hard work and integrity. He told her about the fever that had taken both his parents within days of each other, about the grief that had sent him wandering, taking jobs where he could find them, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. She told him about her own life, about growing up as the daughter of a freight company owner, about learning the business from her father because he had no sons, and refused to believe that a woman could not do the same work as a man. She told him about her mother's death when she was 15, about the closeness she had shared with her father, about her suspicion that Rhodes had poisoned him when he refused to sell his business. She told him about the fear and anger and loneliness of the past 2 months, trying to hold on to everything her father had built while Rhodes circled like a vulture. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening, the conversation flowing easily despite the strangeness of their situation. Victoria made stew from the supplies in the pantry, and they ate together while the wind howled and the snow continued to fall. Thomas's wound had stopped bleeding, and though he was clearly in pain, he insisted he felt well enough to help her secure the house for the night, nailing boards over the broken window and checking the doors and shutters. Night fell early, as it always did in November, and the temperature dropped even further. Victoria knew they would need to stay close to the fire to stay warm, knew that the storm could last for days given how fierce it had started. She brought blankets and pillows from her bedroom, making a nest of sorts near the hearth, and Thomas settled there with a grateful sigh, his body clearly exhausted from the fight and the injury. "You should rest," Victoria said, sitting down beside him. "You lost blood today. You need to let your body heal." "I will rest better knowing you are safe," Thomas said, but his eyes were already starting to drift closed. Within minutes he was asleep, his breathing deep and even, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger. Victoria sat watching him for a long time, her mind racing with everything that had happened. Her life had changed completely in the space of a few hours. Rhodes was dead, his men scattered, and she had a wounded cowboy sleeping in her house, a man who had risked everything to protect her without asking for anything in return. She barely knew him, but she felt drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before, as if some part of her recognized him as someone essential, someone she had been waiting for without realizing it. She thought about the kiss they had shared, about the way it had felt so right, so natural, despite the impossibility of the circumstances. She thought about the way he had looked at her when he talked about seeing her in town, about the quiet conviction in his voice when he said he had found something worth fighting for. Thomas Wade was not a man who spoke carelessly or made promises he could not keep. If he said he cared about her, then he meant it with everything he had. The storm raged on through the night, the wind battering the house, the snow piling higher and higher against the walls. Victoria dozed fitfully, waking every few hours to check on Thomas and add wood to the fire. Each time she woke, she found him sleeping peacefully, his color good despite the injury, and each time she felt a surge of relief and something warmer, something that was beginning to feel a lot like love. Morning came late, the world outside still dark with storm clouds and falling snow. Victoria woke to find Thomas already awake, sitting up carefully and testing the movement of his injured side. He saw her watching and offered a small smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. "Good morning," he said. "Storm is still going strong. How do you feel?" Victoria asked, moving to check his bandages. The wound looked clean, no signs of infection, and she felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Sore," Thomas admitted, "but I will live thanks to you. You did a good job patching me up." "My father taught me," Victoria said. "He said anyone who runs a freight business in this country needs to know basic doctoring, because accidents happen far from town." They shared breakfast, the last of the bread and some preserved jam, and then set about the business of surviving the storm. The house was well built, and her father had always kept plenty of supplies on hand, so they were in no immediate danger. But the isolation was complete. Even if they wanted to go for help, which they did not, travel would have been impossible in the blinding snow. The day passed slowly, measured out in small tasks and quiet conversation. Thomas was not a man who needed to fill silence with meaningless chatter, and Victoria found that comforting. They could sit together for long stretches without talking, simply being in each other's presence, and it felt more intimate than anything she had experienced before. When they did talk, it was about deeper things, about what they wanted from life, about the kind of people they hoped to become. "I want to build something that lasts," Thomas told her as they sat by the fire that afternoon. "I spent 5 years drifting because I did not think I deserved to have a home after my parents died, like settling down somewhere would be betraying their memory. But I realize now that is not what they would have wanted. They built a good life for themselves, and they would want me to do the same." "What would that look like for you?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. "A ranch, a business?" "Maybe both," Thomas said. "I am good with horses. I could start small, breaking and training horses for the ranchers around here, building up a reputation. Eventually, maybe buy some land of my own, build a place that is mine." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Or maybe ours, if you would consider having a partner." Victoria's heart skipped a beat. "Thomas, you do not have to say things like that just because you helped me. You do not owe me anything." "I am not saying it because I owe you," Thomas said, his voice intense. "I am saying it because I have been alone for 5 years, and in one day with you, I have felt more alive, more connected to something real than I have in all that time. I know it is fast. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that what I feel for you is real, and I think you feel it too." Victoria could not deny it. The connection between them was undeniable, a pull that seemed to transcend logic and reason. She had spent 3 weeks feeling trapped and hopeless, and then Thomas had walked into her life and changed everything. He had fought for her, bled for her, and now he was offering her something she had not dared to hope for: a future with someone who understood her, who respected her strength while still wanting to stand beside her. "I do feel it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It scares me how much I feel it. I did not think I would ever want to trust someone again after watching my father die and seeing how quickly people like Rhodes tried to take advantage. But when I look at you, I do not feel afraid. I feel safe. I feel like maybe I have finally found someone who will not let me down." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "I cannot promise that life will be easy or that nothing bad will ever happen. But I can promise that I will stand by you through whatever comes. I will protect you with everything I have, and I will work every day to build something good with you, if you will have me." Victoria squeezed his hand, tears pricking at her eyes. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you. I want to build something with you, Thomas. I want to see what we can create together." He pulled her close then, careful of his injured ribs, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. This was not the desperate kiss of yesterday, born from adrenaline and survival. This was something deeper, a promise and a beginning, the first step toward a future they would build together. The storm lasted 3 more days, trapping them in the house with nothing but each other for company. Those days became a kind of cocoon, a space outside normal time where they could learn everything about each other without the distractions of the outside world. They talked until their voices were hoarse, sharing stories and dreams and fears. They played cards with a worn deck Victoria found in her father's desk. They read aloud from the small collection of books her father had treasured. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the wind. And slowly, carefully, they began to build something between them, a foundation of trust and affection that would grow into love. Thomas's wound healed quickly, and by the 3rd day he was moving almost normally again, though Victoria still fussed over him and insisted he take things easy. He seemed to enjoy her attention, accepting it with a small smile that suggested he was not used to being cared for. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. They woke to sunlight streaming through the gaps in the boards covering the window, and when Thomas carefully opened the front door, they found themselves looking out at a transformed world. The snow was piled nearly 4 feet high in places, glittering like diamonds under the clear blue sky. The air was bitter cold but perfectly still, the silence almost overwhelming after days of howling wind. "We need to check on Rhodes's men," Victoria said, though the thought made her stomach turn. "The ones who were wounded might still be out there." Thomas nodded grimly. "You are right. I do not like those men, but I would not leave anyone to freeze to death if I can help it." They bundled up in every piece of warm clothing they could find and ventured out into the snow. It took them an hour of searching, but they found 2 of Rhodes's wounded men had taken shelter in the stable, likely crawling there after the fight. They were alive but suffering from frostbite and fever. Victoria and Thomas brought them into the house and did what they could to treat their injuries. Though both men were too sick to be a threat, one of them, a young cowboy who could not have been more than 20, looked up at Thomas with fearful eyes. "You going to turn us over to the marshal?" he asked weakly. "The marshal works for Rhodes," Thomas said, "and Rhodes is dead. I expect you boys will tell the truth about what happened here when you are feeling better. You will tell everyone that Rhodes tried to steal this land and that Miss Sommers defended herself. You do that, and I will not press charges for attempted murder." The young cowboy nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I will tell them. Rhodes lied to us, told us you had stolen from him. I did not know the truth until it was too late." Over the next week, as the snow began to melt and travel became possible again, the truth of what had happened spread through Shoshone City. The wounded men kept their word and told everyone who would listen about Rhodes's scheme, and about the cowboy who had stood between Victoria Sommers and 10 armed men to protect her rights. The town marshal, finding himself without Rhodes's protection and money, quietly resigned and left Idaho. The territorial judge reviewed Victoria's father's papers and declared that Rhodes's claims had indeed been forgeries, and Victoria was granted full ownership of the freight business and the land. Thomas stayed by her side through all of it, helping her navigate the legal complications and rebuild the business that had been damaged by Rhodes's interference. He was patient and steady, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give, but always there when she needed him. And Victoria found herself falling more in love with him every day, with his quiet strength and his dry sense of humor, and the way he looked at her like she was the most important person in his world. 3 months after the blizzard, on a clear February morning, Thomas took Victoria out to a piece of land just east of her father's property. It was beautiful country, rolling hills with good water and grass for horses, and Victoria could immediately see the potential in it. "I have been saving my wages from the Miller Ranch," Thomas said, standing beside her and looking out over the land. "Combined with what I have left from selling my parents' place in Texas, I have enough to buy this parcel and start building. I was thinking I could put up a barn first, start taking in horses to train, build a house next year once the business is established." He paused, then turned to look at her. "Or I could build the house first if I had a reason to, like if someone agreed to marry me and wanted a proper home to live in." Victoria felt her breath catch. They had talked about the future in abstract terms, about building something together, but this was different. This was Thomas asking her to take the leap with him, to commit to a life together in this wild, beautiful country. "Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Wade?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Yes, madam, I am," Thomas said, and there was nothing but sincerity in his eyes. "I love you, Victoria. I have loved you since the moment I walked into your house and saw you standing there with that rifle, scared but defiant, refusing to back down. I love your strength and your intelligence and your kindness. I love the way you talk about your father's business, and the way you took care of me when I was wounded, and the way you make me believe that I can be the man I always wanted to be. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building a home and a business and a family. Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Victoria's face, but she was smiling wider than she had smiled in months. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I love you too. I love your courage and your honor and the way you see me as an equal partner instead of something to be protected and controlled. I want to build a life with you. I want everything you are offering." Thomas let out a whoop of joy that startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree, and then he was picking her up and spinning her around, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that left her breathless, and Victoria kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her love and hope and joy into that single moment. They were married in April, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Shoshone City. Half the town turned out to see them wed. The story of the cowboy who had stood against 10 men in a blizzard having become something of a local legend. Victoria wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved, and Thomas wore a new suit that Victoria had insisted on buying him despite his protests that his regular clothes were good enough. The freight business continued to thrive under Victoria's management, and Thomas built his horse training operation with the same steady determination he brought to everything he did. They worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word, building something that was stronger together than either of them could have created alone. The house Thomas built on the new property was beautiful, with large windows that let in the light and a spacious porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset over the mountains. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. There were hard winters and difficult customers, and the endless work of building two businesses from the ground up. But they faced everything together, supporting each other through the tough times and celebrating the victories. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small intimacies of daily life that bound them closer together. Victoria learned that Thomas sang old cowboy songs when he worked with the horses, his voice rough but pleasant. Thomas learned that Victoria talked to herself when she was working on the business accounts, muttering calculations under her breath. In the spring of their second year together, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch, and the look of pure joy on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. He pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, and whispered promises to their unborn child about love and protection, and all the wonderful things they would experience together. Their son was born in November, almost exactly 2 years after the blizzard that had brought them together. They named him James, after Victoria's father, and from the moment Thomas held that tiny baby in his arms, Victoria knew her husband had found the final piece of himself that had been missing. Thomas was a wonderful father, patient and loving and endlessly fascinated by every little thing their son did. As James grew from a baby into a toddler, and then a young boy, Victoria and Thomas's businesses continued to flourish. The freight company expanded its routes, and Thomas's reputation as a horse trainer drew customers from across Idaho and into the neighboring territories. They hired good people to help them, building something that was larger than just themselves, creating opportunities for others in the community. They had 2 more children in the years that followed, a daughter they named Grace and another son they called Henry. The house that had seemed so spacious when it was just the 2 of them filled with the noise and chaos of family life, and Victoria could not imagine being happier. Thomas was the same steady presence he had always been, but fatherhood had softened something in him, brought out a playfulness and joy that he had kept hidden during his years of drifting. On cold November evenings, when the wind howled and snow began to fall, Thomas would gather the children close and tell them the story of how he had met their mother, how 10 men had come after her in a blizzard, and how he had stood between her and all of them with his gun. The children never tired of the story, begging for it again and again, and James, the eldest, would always ask the same question at the end. "Were you scared, Papa?" he would ask, his eyes wide with wonder. "Terrified," Thomas would answer honestly. "But I was more afraid of what would happen to your mother if I did not stand up for what was right. Sometimes being brave does not mean you are not scared. It just means you do what needs to be done even when you are scared." Victoria would watch these moments from across the room, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had changed her life so completely. She thought about that November day so long ago, about the desperate fear she had felt when she saw those 10 men surrounding her property. She thought about the moment Thomas Wade had walked through her door, a stranger offering help for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. She had been prepared to die that day, prepared to fight to her last breath rather than surrender to Rhodes's greed. But Thomas had given her something better than survival. He had given her a future, a partnership, a love that had only grown stronger with each passing year. He had given her children and a home, and the knowledge that she would never have to face the world's cruelties alone again. 20 years after the blizzard, Victoria and Thomas sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Their children were grown now, James working alongside his father in the horse training business, Grace married to a good man and running her own boarding house in town, and Henry studying law with dreams of becoming a territorial judge. The freight business had been sold to a partner who had worked with Victoria for 15 years, providing them with enough income to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Thomas's hair had gone gray at the temples, and Victoria had lines around her eyes that had not been there in her youth. But they were still the same people who had found each other in the midst of violence and fear. Thomas reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly. Taking a chance on a drifter who showed up at your door. Never, Victoria said firmly. Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Thomas Wade. You and the life we built together. I feel the same way, Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I spent 5 years looking for something I could not name, and then I found you. You are my home, Victoria. You always will be. They sat together as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to appear one by one in the darkening sky. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow, and Victoria knew that winter was coming again, as it did every year. But this time, like all the times before, she would face it with Thomas by her side. They had weathered every storm together, and they would continue to do so for all the years they had left. Inside the house, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light through the windows. The house that Thomas had built with his own hands, the house where they had raised their children and built their life together. It was filled with memories and love, every room holding stories of laughter and struggle and triumph. This was what they had created from that single moment of courage in the middle of a blizzard, when a cowboy had stood between a woman and 10 armed men because it was right, because he saw something worth fighting for. As the first snowflakes began to fall, gentle and soft unlike that terrible storm 2 decades ago, Victoria felt Thomas's arm come around her shoulders, pulling her closer. They would go inside soon, to the warmth and comfort of their home, but for now they simply sat together in the twilight. 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from it. The years stretched ahead of them, not endless but precious, each day a gift to be treasured. They would grow old together, watching their grandchildren play in the fields where Thomas trained his horses, watching the world change around them while their love remained constant. They would tell the story of the blizzard and the standoff to anyone who would listen, keeping alive the memory of the day their lives had intersected and changed forever. And when their time finally came, years in the future, they would leave behind a legacy that went beyond businesses and property and money. They would leave behind the memory of 2 people who had loved each other completely, who had built a partnership based on respect and trust, and the simple courage to stand up for what was right. They would leave behind children and grandchildren who carried their values forward into the next generation, spreading the lessons of honor and integrity that Thomas and Victoria had lived by. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this November evening with snow falling softly around them, Thomas Wade and Victoria Sommers Wade simply held each other close and felt grateful for the strange and wonderful path that had brought them together. A path that had started with danger and violence, but had led them to something infinitely precious, something worth every risk and every struggle. Their story, born in the chaos of a blizzard when 10 men had been after her and a cowboy had stood between them with his gun, had become a love story for the ages. It was a testament to the power of courage and the possibility of finding light even in the darkest moments. It was proof that sometimes, when you least expect it, a stranger can walk into your life and become the most important person in your world. As they finally rose and walked hand in hand into their warm house, closing the door against the winter night, Victoria looked back once more at the falling snow. She remembered the fear and desperation of that day 20 years ago, but more than that, she remembered the moment Thomas had appeared, offering help without hesitation. That moment had changed everything, had set them both on a path that had led to more happiness than she had ever dreamed possible. The fire crackled invitingly as they settled in for the evening, Thomas adding another log while Victoria prepared tea. These simple domestic rituals had become the fabric of their life together, the daily expressions of their commitment and love. They had built something real and lasting, something that would endure long after they were gone, carried forward in the hearts and memories of everyone who knew them. And outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, covering the land where so much had happened, where a love story had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. The blizzard that night was gentle, nothing like the terrible storm that had raged 20 years ago, but it reminded them both of where they had come from and how far they had traveled together. It reminded them that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth standing up for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Thomas Wade had proven that on a cold November day, and every day since. He and Victoria had continued to prove it to each other, building a life that honored the courage and conviction that had brought them together.